Hey guys, tonight we slip away from the noise of Earth and drift toward a small, shining world that most people have seen without really meeting. You can picture it low in the twilight, close to the horizon, glowing softly in a band of fading gold, never quite staying long enough to feel ordinary. It appears like a secret with good manners, brief and bright, then gone again before the sky fully settles. Before you get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here with me. And if you feel like it, post your location and local time in the comments, because I always love the thought of this quiet little night journey stretching across different rooms, different cities, different corners of the world. Let the world slow down for a moment. Let the fan murmur softly nearby, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Mercury has a funny reputation. It is the closest planet to the Sun, which makes people imagine something dramatic, angry, blazing, and probably yelling. But when you come closer in the imagination, it feels different. Mercury is quiet, very quiet. It is a small world of stone and metal, turning patiently in a brightness so strong it almost erases the idea of distance. And yet somehow the planet itself feels reserved, almost shy, as if it has spent billions of years minding its own business while the rest of the solar system tries very hard to be memorable. From Earth, Mercury can be hard to spot, and that difficulty has given it a strange kind of charm. You do not usually find it high overhead in a dark midnight sky. It stays near the sun from our point of view, which means you catch it only around sunrise or sunset, hanging low in the glow. It appears in the evening for a while, then disappears. Later it may return in the morning, pale and elegant in the growing light. It never performs for very long. Which is rude, honestly, but also beautiful. You have to meet Mercury on its terms. That is part of what makes it relaxing to think about. It is not a planet that barges into your attention. It waits near the edge of visibility. Ancient skywatchers knew it well, though not always as one single object at first. Because Mercury can appear either before dawn or after sunset, some early cultures treated those appearances as different celestial visitors. Only later did people realize that the same little planet was moving around the sun, showing itself first on one side, then the other, like a quiet actor using two entrances and never bothering to explain the trick. Even today, Mercury keeps some of that elusive personality. Venus gets all the glamorous attention, Jupiter arrives with authority, Saturn wears the famous rings like a cosmic celebrity who knows exactly why you bought the ticket. Mercury is subtler than that. It is smaller than Earth by a wide margin, only a little larger than our moon, and yet it is still a full planet, complete and ancient and carrying an extraordinary story in a compact form. It is a reminder that grandeur does not always need size. Sometimes grandeur is dense, silent, and very close to the light. If you were somehow floating above the inner solar system, Mercury would seem to trace a tight, fast path around the sun. It is the innermost planet, the first major world out from the solar furnace, and that closeness shapes everything about it. The sunlight there is much stronger than what reaches Earth. The sun itself would look far larger in Mercury's sky, not just a bright disk but a commanding presence, huge and brilliant, as if the whole concept of daytime had been turned up several levels by someone who had no interest in subtlety. And yet Mercury is not simply a burning rock. That would be too easy, and the universe is often more interesting when it resists easy descriptions. One side of Mercury can become incredibly hot under the intense sunlight, but because the planet has almost no real atmosphere to hold and distribute heat, the temperature can plunge terribly low in darkness. So Mercury is a world of extremes, but the feeling of it is still not chaos. It is more like pure exposure, light where there is light, cold where there is no light, no soft blanket of air, no weather drifting through to blend one place into another, no thick clouds turning sharp edges into gradients. Just direct experience, almost brutally honest, but in a way that becomes strangely serene when you sit with it for a while. The lack of a thick atmosphere also means the sky above Mercury would not look blue. There is no broad, airy dome like the one you know on Earth. Instead, space stays black even in the daytime. Imagine standing on a silent plain of ancient gray stone with the sun blazing above a black sky. It sounds severe at first, but then it becomes very still in the mind, very clean. The kind of stillness that strips away clutter, the sort of place where every shadow matters. And Mercury has had a very long time to collect shadows. Its surface is heavily cratered, marked by impacts from the early history of the solar system. Many of those scars have remained there for immense stretches of time because there is so little atmosphere, wind, or flowing water to erase them. On Earth, landscapes are constantly revised. Rain softens one shape, rivers carve another, oceans take the edges down, forests grow over the memory of what came before. Mercury does not really do revision. It remembers. You can think of it as a planet that keeps old photographs in perfect condition, tucked away in a drawer one opens very often. That old age gives Mercury a kind of dignity. Its surface tells a story from a time when the solar system was younger, rougher, more crowded with debris. The marks left behind are not just damage, they are records. They are the preserved handwriting of early planetary history. And because Mercury has stayed so physically quiet for so long, much of that writing can still be read. Later, we will come back to the strange beauty of those scars because they matter more than they first seem to. For now, it is enough to stay with the first impression. A small planet, a hard, bright neighborhood, a world that rises briefly in Earth's twilight like a thought you almost miss. There is something deeply comforting in the fact that Mercury has always been there, circling steadily, keeping close to the sun through every chapter of human history. Long before cities glowed at night, long before ships crossed oceans, long before clocks were hanging on walls telling people they were late for things they did not even want to attend, Mercury was already making its quick, elegant circuit. Its name in Roman tradition came from the swift-footed messenger god, and that choice makes sense. Mercury moves quickly through our sky compared with many other planets, and it races around the sun faster than any of its planetary neighbors. But the speed is not frantic when you picture it out there in space. It is precise, rhythmic, a kind of celestial efficiency. You can almost feel the neatness of its orbit, the small inner path tucked close around the sun like a secret ring. And the more you think about that motion, the more Mercury begins to feel less like a remote object and more like a participant in a larger harmony. Every planet has its pace. Every world keeps time in its own way. Mercury's time is especially strange, and soon that strangeness will become one of the most beautiful parts of the journey. Its year is short. Its day is far more complicated. Sunrise itself behaves in a way that would seem almost impossible if the solar system were less comfortable with being wonderfully odd. So keep this first image nearby. A little planet in the evening glow, half hidden by brightness, old as memory, quick in its orbit, silent on its surface, and far more subtle than its fierce address might suggest. You are not looking at a loud world. You are looking at a patient one. A world that asks you to notice small details. A world that rewards slow attention. And once you do give it that attention, Mercury starts opening very gently, one quiet fact at a time. That quiet attention changes the way Mercury feels almost immediately, because once you stop expecting it to be loud, you start noticing how graceful it really is. Its motion is the first beautiful surprise. Mercury is the fastest planet in the solar system, circling the sun in only about 88 Earth days. So while you are here moving through seasons, appointments, tired Mondays, and those oddly ambitious evenings when you believe tomorrow will be the day you finally organize every drawer in your home, Mercury has already completed another neat, elegant lap around the sun and gone on with its business. That short year gives the planet a curious personality. It lives close to the source of light, and because of that, everything about its path feels tighter, quicker, more concentrated. If Earth's orbit feels like a wide and balanced journey, Mercury's feels like a close whisper around the fire. The planet moves at an average speed of around 47 kilometers per second, which is astonishingly fast, though space is so vast that even this incredible motion still looks calm from a distance. That is one of the nicest tricks the cosmos ever plays. Things can be moving at tremendous speed and still appear completely serene. It is a useful thought to keep nearby. You can imagine Mercury tracing its orbit again and again, small and steady, as if it has learned something about efficiency that the rest of us are still trying to pick up. There is no wasted gesture in its path, no dramatic swing out toward the cold outer dark. It remains in the inner region of the solar system, always relatively near the sun, always within that intense brightness. Because of this, Mercury never strays very far from the sun in our sky. That is why you only glimpse it near dawn or dusk. Even when it is visible, it keeps close to the horizon, like a planet with excellent boundaries. Its orbit, though, is not a perfect circle. It is noticeably stretched, more elliptical than the orbits of most major planets. That means Mercury's distance from the sun changes more over the course of its year than Earth's does over ours. At its closest, it comes very near the sun, and at its farthest, it pulls a little farther away. Not far in the way you might casually mean it. Space has very high standards for what counts as far, but enough to matter. Enough to change the amount of sunlight reaching the planet quite a bit. This stretched orbit makes Mercury feel less like a mechanical diagram and more like a real traveler, moving through slightly different conditions as it goes. Sometimes it is in a more intense blaze, sometimes in a somewhat gentler version of the same blaze, which, to be fair, is still extremely bright. The sun from Mercury is never shy. Even at the planet's most distant point in orbit, it would still dominate the sky with a size and intensity that would feel almost overwhelming compared with what you know on Earth. And yet this changing distance from the sun is only part of what makes Mercury's timing so strange. The deeper charm comes from the way its orbit and rotation interact. Mercury spins very slowly on its axis. It takes about 59 Earth days to rotate once relative to the distant stars. So you have a planet that races around the sun while turning on its own axis at a much more patient pace. The result is one of the most elegant little timing relationships in the solar system, a resonance between motion and motion, almost musical in its structure. Mercury is locked in what is called a 3-to-2 spin-orbit resonance. The phrase sounds slightly as if it should come with a textbook and a headache, but the idea is simple and lovely once you sit with it. For every 2 trips Mercury makes around the sun, it rotates 3 times on its axis. That ratio is stable, precise, and deeply unusual. Many moons in the solar system are locked more simply, keeping one face toward the object they orbit. Mercury found a more interesting arrangement. It is not fully tidally locked, and it is not freely spinning in the way Earth is. It lives in between, in this graceful pattern of 3 turns for every 2 years. That resonance changes the experience of time on Mercury in a way that almost feels poetic. If you measured one noon to the next noon on Mercury, one solar day would last about 176 Earth days. So a Mercury day, in the everyday sense of sunrise to sunrise, is twice as long as a Mercury year. That is such a strange little fact that it deserves to be held gently for a moment. On Mercury, the sunlit cycle takes longer than the trip around the sun itself. A planet can finish a year before it finishes a full day, which feels mildly unreasonable, but in a very elegant way. You can sense why ancient astronomers and later scientists found Mercury so intriguing. Even when they did not yet know every detail, this was clearly not an ordinary world. It behaved differently. It kept its own rhythm. It reminded people that the solar system is not built from copies of one comfortable template. Every planet negotiates with gravity in its own style. Mercury's style just happens to be wonderfully odd. This fast orbit also played a subtle role in the history of science. Mercury's motion around the Sun became especially important when astronomers noticed that its orbit shifted in a way classical Newtonian physics could not fully explain. The point in Mercury's orbit closest to the Sun, called the perihelion, slowly moved over time, and there was a small extra amount of that motion that remained unexplained for years. It was one of those quiet scientific puzzles that sat there patiently, waiting for the right mind to come along. And then in the early 20th century, Einstein's general theory of relativity provided the missing answer. Mercury, so close to the Sun and so responsive to its gravity, turned out to be a perfect place to see the subtle effects of spacetime curvature. In a sense, Mercury helped confirm that gravity is not simply a force reaching across emptiness, but a shaping of space and time themselves. That is a grand sentence for such a small planet, and yet somehow it fits. Mercury does not need to be large to matter. It just has to be exactly where it is. There is something very soothing in that thought. This little world, often hard to see, often overlooked, helped reveal one of the deepest truths in physics. You could almost miss it in the twilight, and still it quietly participated in changing humanity's understanding of the universe. That is classic Mercury behavior, really. Subtle entrance, important contribution, leaves early. And still, the most immediate wonder is the rhythm of the place. Imagine living where the calendar would feel so different from the daily sky, where a year would pass while sunlight still lingered in its vast, slow movement across the horizon. Imagine watching the sun as an enormous presence, seeming to govern everything, while the planet beneath you hurries along its tight orbit with extraordinary precision. It would feel as though time had been gently rearranged, not broken, just tuned to another pattern. Mercury teaches this very softly. It teaches that time is not one thing everywhere. A day is not always what you think it is. A year is not always the grander measure. Sometimes the smaller orbit wins. Sometimes the sunlight takes its time. Sometimes a planet near the sun creates a rhythm so unusual that sunrise itself starts to behave in ways that seem almost dreamlike. Keep that image nearby because it matters soon. A fast year, a slow turning world, a sky where the sun does not always move in the simple, reliable way your earth-trained instincts expect. On Mercury, time and light enter into a kind of conversation, and the result is one of the strangest and most beautiful mornings in the solar system. The strange part begins very gently, because Mercury does not announce its oddness with noise or spectacle. It simply lets the rules of ordinary expectation loosen a little. You already know that it circles the sun quickly and turns on its axis slowly. And when those two motions meet, the sky above Mercury starts doing something so unusual that it feels almost like a thought experiment dreamed up by a patient physicist who had not been outside in a while. Except it is real. Quietly, completely real. If you could stand on Mercury's surface, safely protected from every inconvenient and frankly unreasonable condition there, you would not experience sunrise the way you do on Earth. Here, morning has a familiar rhythm. The sun rises in the east, climbs through the sky, and sets in the west. Day unfolds with a dependable sort of grace. Mercury is more complicated, but not in a messy way. More in the way a beautiful clock is complicated, with hidden gears turning at slightly different speeds. Because Mercury rotates 3 times for every 2 orbits around the Sun, and because its orbit is noticeably stretched, the apparent motion of the Sun in its sky can behave in a deeply strange manner. At some places on Mercury, the Sun can appear to rise, slow down, stop, and even reverse direction for a time before continuing again. Just hold that image for a moment. A sunrise that hesitates, a sun that seems to reconsider, morning but with second thoughts. This happens because Mercury's orbital speed changes as it moves along its elliptical path. When it is closer to the Sun, it travels faster in orbit. That changing orbital speed, combined with the planet's slow rotation, can briefly alter the way the Sun seems to move across the sky. So from the ground, the motion of the Sun is not always a simple one-way crossing. There are places and moments where the sky seems to pause and shift, as if even light itself has decided to take a slower, more thoughtful route. It is hard to find a more dreamlike fact in planetary science, and the best part is that it is not decorative. It is not a poetic exaggeration. It is the natural result of real orbital mechanics. Mercury becomes one of those lovely reminders that the universe does not need help being imaginative. It already is. You can picture the experience. The horizon is rough and ancient, broken by crater rims and long shadows. The sky is black even in daylight because there is almost no atmosphere to scatter sunlight into blue. Above that blackness hangs the Sun, much larger than it appears from Earth, brilliant and commanding. Slowly it rises. Slowly it climbs. Then for a while the climb changes. The Sun seems to stall. Perhaps it drifts backward. Perhaps it lingers as if it has become interested in the view. And all around you, nothing moves except light and shadow. That stillness matters. On Earth, the atmosphere is always doing something. There is wind in trees, weather gathering somewhere, clouds reshaping the sky every few minutes, birds deciding to be involved. Mercury leaves you with something much barer. There is no proper weather, no moving blanket of air, no soft murmur of a living planet busy with water and breath. It is a place where sunlight itself becomes one of the main events. And because Mercury's solar day lasts about 176 Earth days, those events unfold with extraordinary patience. Daytime, there is not a quick cycle. It stretches. Shadows shift by degrees so small they almost feel ceremonial. If you watched a boulder or crater wall over time, its shadow would slide in slow motion across the ground, inching over stone that has already waited billions of years. Mercury is very good at making urgency look slightly unnecessary. That long day also changes the way heat builds on the surface. Under the direct glare of the Sun, the ground can become intensely hot, hot enough to melt lead if you were somehow careless enough to leave some lying around, which feels like a very specific mistake, but Mercury is ready for it. On the dark side, without sunlight and without a substantial atmosphere to hold warmth, temperatures can plunge far below anything comfortable. So the planet does not drift through mild afternoons or breezy evenings. It moves between brilliant exposure and deep cold, with very little cushioning in between. But even that contrast can feel strangely clean in the imagination. Mercury does not blur its conditions, it presents them plainly. Sunlit ground absorbs enormous heat, shadow loses it. There is almost no air to soften the transition. It is a world where the simple presence or absence of sunlight changes everything. That gives the landscape a severe beauty, almost architectural in its logic. Light is power, shadow is refuge. A crater rim is no small thing. A valley wall can divide one kind of existence from another. You begin to understand why the surface would look so sharp, so stark, so full of meaning. On Earth, atmosphere and weather create softness. On Mercury, edges remain edges. The line between illumination and darkness can feel absolute. And since the Sun moves so slowly overhead, those boundaries linger. They stretch out in time as well as in space. A single sunrise can shape the land for weeks. A single noon can seem endless. There is something almost meditative in a world where the sky moves this slowly. You would not live by a quick glance upward. You would live by gradual change. A bright edge creeping across the ground. A rock face warming over weeks. A shadow withdrawing with immense reluctance. Mercury invites a slower kind of noticing, the kind that asks you to sit still long enough for subtle things to become the whole experience. This may be one reason the planet feels so unexpectedly calming once you stop thinking of it as merely the hot one near the sun. Its reality is more nuanced than that. Heat is part of the story, yes, but so is slowness. So is silence. So is the way time opens out across the surface until one sunrise becomes almost a season of its own. On Mercury, the day is not a quick frame around activity. The day is the landscape. It stretches over everything. And because the sun appears so much larger there, the emotional effect would be extraordinary. From Earth, the sun is bright and central, but still far enough away to feel like a familiar star. From Mercury, it would feel much more present, much more physically there in the sky. Depending on where Mercury is in its orbit, the sun would appear significantly larger or smaller, because the planet's distance from it changes. So even the size of the sun would not remain perfectly constant from one Mercury season to another. The central light of the sky would subtly swell and shrink over time, as though the heavens themselves were breathing. Keep that image nearby, a black sky, a huge sun, a horizon of old stone, a sunrise so slow it nearly becomes a philosophy. The more you imagine Mercury, the less it seems like a hostile little furnace, and the more it becomes a place where the basic ingredients of planetary life are stripped down to their essentials. Rock, iron, light, cold, time, motion, silence. And in that silence, Mercury begins to reveal another side of itself. Its surface is not only shaped by sunlight moving slowly across it. It is shaped by memory. Craters remain. Basins endure. Ancient impacts are still written across the land with remarkable clarity. This is a planet that keeps the marks of its early history almost politely on display, as if it sees no reason to redecorate. Once you have watched the sun hesitate in its sky, you are ready to look downward and notice what all those long ages have left behind. Once you begin looking down at Mercury instead of only up at its strange sky, the planet becomes even more beautiful in a very quiet way. Its surface is old. Not just old in the casual way people describe mountains or ruins, but ancient on a scale that gently humbles the imagination. Mercury preserves landscapes from very early in the history of the solar system, and because so little has happened there to erase them, much of that old surface still remains. It is like walking into a library where the books have been left open for billions of years, untouched by rain, wind, forests, rivers, or anything else that might have softened the pages. That is one of Mercury's most peaceful qualities. It does not change quickly. It does not cover its history with new weather or restless oceans. It remembers in stone. If you were to glide above the surface, you would see craters almost everywhere, scattered across plains and overlapping one another in places like old circular echoes. Some are small and neat. Some are immense, with bright rays of material thrown outward from the impact. Some are so old and softened by later collisions that they feel less like individual events and more like part of the texture of the planet itself. The whole world has the look of something that has endured a great deal and then fallen into a very deep stillness. Our moon looks a little similar at first glance, and that resemblance is real. Both worlds are heavily cratered and airless. Both preserve ancient scars well, and both tell stories from the solar system's rough early years. But Mercury is not just a copy of the moon sitting closer to the sun. Its gravity is stronger, its composition is different, and its history has its own character. The surface carries signs of intense impacts, yes, but also evidence of volcanic activity long ago, great structural changes, and a dense interior that shaped the planet in ways the eye cannot fully see at first. One of the most striking regions on Mercury is the enormous Caloris Basin, one of the largest impact basins in the solar system. It was created by a colossal collision early in the planet's history, when a large object slammed into Mercury with enough force to leave behind a basin roughly 1,500 kilometers across. Even saying that softly, the scale is hard to hold in your mind. It is so large that it changes the emotional feel of the landscape. It is less a crater in the ordinary sense, and more a giant memory pressed into the planet's surface. You can imagine the impact long ago, not as a dramatic action scene, because Mercury has no interest in becoming a trailer, but as an immense event whose consequences remained far longer than the violence itself. The basin stayed. The rings, cracks, and volcanic plains associated with it stayed. The planet carried the mark quietly forward through age after age, while sunlight drifted over it in slow silence. On the opposite side of Mercury from Caloris, there is a strange region of broken and jumbled terrain, often called weird terrain, which is a wonderfully honest name by scientific standards. It appears that shock waves from the Caloris impact may have traveled through the planet and disrupted the surface on the far side. So one giant collision may have shaken the whole world deeply enough to disturb land on the opposite hemisphere. That is a beautiful and slightly eerie thought. A single event, so powerful that the memory of it appeared in two places at once. Mercury is full of little reminders that rock can carry history farther than you expect. And yet the surface is not only a museum of impacts. There are smooth plains too, broad regions that seem to have been resurfaced by ancient volcanic flows. Long ago, Mercury was more geologically active than it appears now. Molten material rose and spread across parts of the landscape, filling lower areas and softening some of the older topography. So even on a world that feels quiet and preserved, there were times of change, times when the interior sent heat and motion upward and reshaped the crust. That matters because it gives Mercury a more layered identity. It is not only the victim of impacts, it is also a world that once moved from within. It had its own episodes of internal energy, its own forms of resurfacing, its own periods of transformation. The silence you see now came after all that, and in a way, that makes the silence more meaningful. It is the silence of a world that has already lived through its louder ages. The craters themselves are full of small elegance. Their rims catch sunlight sharply because there is no atmosphere to blur the edges. Their interiors can hold long, dark shadows that stretch across the ground like ink. Central peaks rise in some of the larger craters where the surface rebounded after impact, leaving little mountains inside giant bowls. Ejecta blankets spread outward in pale textures around younger craters, tracing where material once flew and settled. Every feature feels crisp, almost careful, because erosion on Mercury is so limited. The planet does not hurry to erase details. On Earth, you rarely see permanence this clearly. Water is always negotiating with stone. Air is always touching every surface. Plants, microbes, ice, and changing temperatures all participate in the quiet editing of the land. Mercury is missing most of those editors, so the surface retains an honesty that feels almost severe, but it is also calming. A crater stays a crater. A basin stays a basin. A cliff holds its line for ages. Nothing fusses over the arrangement. There is also an emotional tenderness in the idea that such a small planet can carry so much time so visibly. Mercury does not hide the early solar system behind layers of later life. It leaves the record in plain view. You can imagine billions of years laid out across the ground like pages in a stone archive, each crater a note from an era when worlds were still settling into their present forms. And because Mercury turns so slowly under its black sky, those scars are illuminated with extraordinary patience. Sunlight does not rush across them, it lingers. A crater wall may glow for days and days. A basin floor may slowly emerge from darkness until every subtle contour becomes visible. Then, just as slowly, the shadows grow again. The land has time to be seen. That feels important somehow. Mercury's history is not only preserved, it is presented slowly. You may begin to sense that this planet has a different relationship with memory than Earth does. Earth is beautiful because it is alive with change. Mercury is beautiful because it holds still long enough for ancient things to remain legible. One world sings, the other listens. One is full of moving weather and breathing oceans. The other keeps faith with silence. That silence extends beyond the absence of sound. It lives in the lack of atmosphere, in the emptiness above the ground, in the fact that no leaves tremble and no clouds gather, and no rain ever arrives to make the dust smell rich and familiar. Mercury offers none of those comforts. Instead, it offers the comfort of clear form, of old light on old stone, of history resting openly where it fell. And the longer you stay there in the imagination, the more the scars begin to feel less like damage and more like structure. They tell you how the planet endured. They tell you how early the shaping began. They tell you that even in the inner solar system, close to the sun, where light seems too intense for softness, there is room for quiet endurance and deep time. Some of those long-preserved features hint at another slow and remarkable truth about Mercury. The planet did not simply cool and become still. It has actually been shrinking, just a little over immense spans of time. As its interior lost heat, the whole world contracted, and the surface responded by folding, faulting, and pushing up long cliffs. So beneath the craters and plains lies another story, one of gradual tightening, of a planet settling inward on itself with incredible patience. And that is where Mercury becomes even stranger and somehow even more intimate. It is not only scarred by the outside, it has also been changing from within, slowly drawing itself smaller, leaving wrinkles of stone across its ancient face. That inward settling gives Mercury a different kind of beauty, one that feels almost private. After spending time with its craters and basins, you might imagine the planet as a world shaped mostly by things that came from outside, by collisions, by ancient impacts, by the rough traffic of the early solar system. But Mercury has also been shaped by a slower, quieter process, something that belongs entirely to the planet itself. Over immense spans of time, as its interior cooled, Mercury contracted, very gently, very steadily, and the surface, unable to stay perfectly smooth while the planet beneath it became slightly smaller, responded by folding and breaking into long cliffs and ridges. It is one of the most unexpectedly tender facts about Mercury, a whole planet shrinking with age, not dramatically, not in any rushed or theatrical way, but gradually, like something cooling after being forged. You can think of the early Mercury as a hotter world, with more internal energy, more motion under the crust, more heat held inside from its formation and from the violence of long-ago impacts. As that heat escaped into space over billions of years, the interior slowly cooled. Materials deep inside became a little denser. The whole body of the planet tightened. And because the outer crust had already hardened, it could not simply glide inward without consequence. It had to adjust. It had to crack and crumple slightly, leaving behind enormous landforms called scarps, long cliff-like features where one part of the crust was pushed up over another. These scarps are among the most distinctive features on Mercury. Some stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Some rise high enough to create dramatic changes in the landscape, especially when the sun is low and the shadows are long. They cut across older craters and plains, which tells you something very useful and very elegant. The craters were already there. The plains were already there. Then later, after much of that older surface had formed, the planet continued cooling and contracting, and the scarps appeared across the existing terrain. Mercury is practically showing you the order of its own history if you look patiently enough. There is something deeply satisfying in that. The planet is not only beautiful to look at, it is readable. From orbit, these scarps can look like giant wrinkles in the crust, the sort of lines you might see on cooled fruit skin or drying clay, except stretched to planetary scale. Scientists sometimes describe them as thrust faults, where one block of crust has been forced over another as the surface compressed. It is a very technical phrase for something that feels strangely intimate. Mercury's face carries folds from a life of cooling. Its surface records the slow physical truth that even worlds made of rock and metal do not stay exactly as they began. And because Mercury has so little atmosphere and so little erosion, those wrinkles remain visible for an incredibly long time. On Earth, similar tectonic structures can be modified by weather, by rivers, by ice, by plants, by every restless thing that participates in the editing of a landscape. On Mercury, the scarps are left largely alone. They sit under the black sky and catch the sunlight exactly as they have for age after age, almost as if the planet is calmly displaying its own process of aging. That may be one of the reasons Mercury feels so unexpectedly emotional once you spend enough time with it. It is not alive, of course, not in the biological sense, and yet it carries signs of change that are easy to relate to. It has scars from outside. It has lines from within. It has cooled. It has contracted. It has kept going. There is something quietly noble in that. Some estimates suggest Mercury may have shrunk in radius by several kilometers over its history. That does not sound like much when spoken softly, but across an entire planet, it is a substantial change. It means the crust had to accommodate a great deal of compression, and the resulting fault scarps are the visible evidence of that planetary adjustment. They are not random decorations. They are mechanical consequences of a world becoming smaller and denser over time. You can imagine standing near one of these great cliffs on Mercury, with the ground rising sharply ahead of you in a long, broken wall of stone. The horizon would already feel ancient because of the cratered terrain, but the scarp would add another level of meaning. It would tell you that this world did not only suffer impacts and then sit still forever. It continued evolving. Quietly, inwardly, patiently. The rock itself was still responding to the deep cooling of the planet below. And that cooling points toward one of Mercury's most interesting secrets. For such a small planet, Mercury has an unusually large core, a huge metal heart occupying a very large fraction of its interior. That oversized core helps explain why Mercury is so dense, why it behaves the way it does, and why its contraction story matters so much. A world with a giant metallic interior carries its own kind of long memory. Heat moves through it. Structure depends on it. Even the magnetic field, faint but real, is tied to what is happening deep below the surface. So these cliffs and faults are not just surface features. They are little messages from the interior. That connection between outside and inside is part of what makes Mercury feel complete. The craters tell you about the environment around the planet, about ancient impacts and the early solar system. The scarps tell you about the planet itself, about its cooling and tightening and internal history. Together, they give Mercury a layered identity. It is not merely a passive object near the sun. It is a world with its own biography. And the pace of that biography is wonderfully slow. Nothing about Mercury asks you to hurry. The planet's shrinkage happened over billions of years. Its cliffs formed over spans so long that human history would vanish inside them like a breath in winter air. There is comfort in that scale, a reminder that some changes are not crises. Some changes are simply deep time doing what deep time does. If you stay with that thought, Mercury begins to feel less severe and more contemplative. The planet is honest about age. It does not pretend to be untouched. It does not hide its fractures. It lets the evidence remain. Craters from impacts, plains from old volcanic activity, scarps from contraction. Every feature saying in its own silent way, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. The world assembled itself across time and never erased the notes. There is also a lovely contrast between Mercury's shrinking crust and the vast space around it. Here is a tiny planet close to the Sun, apparently simple at first glance, yet carrying these enormous structural records of internal change. It reminds you again that small things in the universe are often more intricate than they first appear. Mercury does not need oceans, clouds, rings, or storms to hold your attention. It only needs stone, light, and enough patience for the truth to become visible. And that truth leads naturally inward. Once you start thinking about a planet cooling and contracting, you begin to wonder what exactly lies beneath that battered crust. What kind of interior produces such large-scale shrinkage? What kind of planet can be so small and yet so dense? Why Mercury, of all the rocky planets, carries such a large proportion of metal inside it? The answer takes you deeper than the scarps, deeper than the crater floors and volcanic plains, into the hidden structure of Mercury itself. Beneath the ancient surface lies one of the strangest and most important facts about this little world: its enormous iron core, a buried center so large that it defines the whole character of the planet. The deeper you go with Mercury, the more it stops feeling like a small leftover planet and starts feeling like a very concentrated one, as if the solar system took a great deal of material, pressure, heat, and history, and packed it into a world that prefers understatement. Beneath the cratered surface, beneath the long cliffs and folded crust, Mercury holds an enormous metallic core. This is one of the defining facts about the planet, and once you know it, so many other quiet details begin to make sense. Mercury is the second smallest planet in the solar system, only larger than Pluto if you are feeling nostalgic about former classifications, and yet it is astonishingly dense. If you compare it with the other rocky planets, Mercury turns out to be far heavier for its size than its modest appearance might suggest. Earth is the only planet denser overall, and even that comparison is a little unfair, because Earth's greater mass compresses its interior more strongly under gravity. If you could account for that compression and compare the materials more directly, Mercury would seem even more impressively rich in metal. The reason is its core. Mercury's metallic core is enormous relative to the size of the planet. It takes up roughly about 85% of the planet's radius, which is extraordinary. You can picture Mercury almost as a giant iron sphere wearing a relatively thin, rocky coat. That is a simplification, of course, but it is useful. Earth has a large core too, but Mercury's dominates the planet in a way that feels more extreme, more central to its entire identity. This little world is built around metal. That oversized core changes the emotional feel of the planet once you know it is there. The surface may look dry, gray, and ancient, but deep below lies something dense and powerful, a hidden interior that shaped the entire life story of the planet. It is one of those lovely moments in planetary science where the visible surface and the invisible interior suddenly fit together. The shrinkage we talked about earlier begins to feel more understandable. A planet with so much metal inside, cooling over billions of years, would naturally change in deep structural ways. The scarps on the surface become the quiet outer expression of what the interior has been doing for an immense length of time. Scientists have spent years trying to understand why Mercury ended up with such a large core. There are a few ideas, and each one has its own charm. One possibility is that Mercury formed from material in the early solar system that was already especially rich in metal. Closer to the young sun, temperatures were high, and perhaps lighter, more volatile materials were less abundant there, leaving a building zone with more metallic ingredients. Another idea suggests that Mercury may once have had more rocky outer material, but a giant collision early in its history stripped away much of that mantle, leaving behind a body proportionally richer in iron. There are also versions of the story involving repeated impacts or energetic solar conditions in the young inner solar system. No single explanation is held with perfect certainty in every detail, which is often the case when you are reconstructing events from the first chapters of planetary formation. But the broad fact remains beautifully solid. However it got there, Mercury ended up with an unusually large metal core, and that core is central to almost everything interesting about the planet. There is something very calming about the idea of a hidden center this dominant. You imagine the outside first, because that is what the eye sees. Craters, cliffs, plains, long shadows. Then gradually, as your understanding deepens, the invisible becomes more important than the visible. Beneath that old stone lies the true weight of Mercury's character. And this core is not just large. At least part of it is still molten. That detail matters a great deal because it helps explain another surprising feature of Mercury. The planet has a magnetic field. It is not as strong as Earth's, and it behaves differently in some ways, but the fact that Mercury has a global magnetic field at all is remarkable. A small planet so close to the Sun, with such an ancient surface, still carries enough internal dynamism to produce magnetism. Again, Mercury does what it does best: quiet appearance, deeper complexity. The magnetic field is thought to come from motion in the liquid outer part of the core, a kind of internal circulation of conductive material that creates a dynamo effect. Earth works on a similar principle, though under very different conditions. The simple version is that moving liquid metal inside a planet can generate magnetic fields. So deep within Mercury, the iron-rich interior is not merely sitting there in silence like a decorative paperweight. It is still participating, still shaping the space around the planet. That idea feels important. Mercury is old, heavily cratered, and outwardly still, but it is not entirely frozen into passivity. Somewhere below the crust, the core remains active enough to matter. You begin to sense that the planet is more alive in a geological sense than its quiet surface first suggests. Not active like Earth with plate tectonics, oceans, weather, and endless recycling. Much quieter than that. More like a low, hidden pulse than a visible performance. The core may also help explain some subtle details about how Mercury cools and contracts. As the interior evolves, as heat escapes over deep time, the boundary between different layers changes. The planet's physical structure adjusts. Everything connects back to that buried metallic heart. Mercury is one of those worlds where the inside explains the outside with unusual elegance. And because the crust and mantle above the core are relatively thin compared with the planet's overall radius, you can almost imagine the surface as a delicate shell stretched over something much denser and more dominant below. It gives Mercury a different feeling from worlds with thicker outer layers. The planet feels concentrated, compressed, reduced to essentials. The universe built a rocky planet, then trimmed away almost every unnecessary flourish. There is also a kind of poetry in Mercury's density. So often in life, things that look small are assumed to be simple or slight. Mercury quietly refuses that assumption. It is compact, but it carries weight. It is modest in size, but rich in consequence. Even in the history of science, this hidden depth mattered. The planet's behavior helped confirm general relativity. Its structure helps astronomers understand how rocky planets form and evolve. Its magnetic field complicates tidy assumptions about what small planets can and cannot do. Mercury keeps contributing beyond its apparent scale. If you were somehow able to descend through the crust and into the planet, the story would change from brittle stone to a realm governed by pressure, metal, and heat. Of course, no one is casually strolling into Mercury's core. That would be an extremely committed field trip. But spacecraft measurements, studies of the planet's density, spin, gravity, and magnetic field have allowed scientists to infer a great deal about what lies inside. This is one of the quiet triumphs of planetary science. You do not always need to touch a place directly to understand its hidden structure. Sometimes motion, mass, and magnetism tell the story for you. And Mercury tells it clearly. A large iron core, a liquid outer layer, a dense body shaped by heat, cooling, and time. A planet whose most important feature is buried beneath everything you can see. Keep that in mind, because it changes the next part of the journey in a lovely way. Once you know Mercury has a magnetic field, you stop seeing it as merely exposed to the sun. You begin to realize that the planet is interacting with the solar wind, negotiating with it, shaping charged particles around itself. Space near Mercury is not empty calm. It is full of motion you cannot see with your eyes, a delicate invisible ballet between sunlight, magnetism, and a whisper-thin envelope of atoms. And that is where Mercury becomes even more beautiful, because around this dense little planet, close to the blazing sun, there exists a magnetic murmur in the dark. Once you know Mercury carries a magnetic field, the space around it stops feeling empty. It becomes active in a very delicate way, almost like a silent conversation happening just beyond sight. Mercury sits close to the sun, so close that it is constantly immersed in a powerful flow of charged particles called the solar wind. This wind is not wind in the earthly sense. Nothing is rustling, nothing is bending, nothing is making that familiar sound through leaves or across a rooftop. It is a stream of particles flowing outward from the sun through space, and near Mercury, that stream is fast, hot, and persistent. If Mercury had no magnetic field at all, the solar wind would strike the planet's surface more directly almost everywhere, day after day, with very little resistance. But Mercury does have a field faint compared with Earth's, yet strong enough to create a magnetosphere, a region where the motion of charged particles is shaped by the planet's internal magnetism. It is a small magnetosphere compressed tightly by the sun's force, but it is there. That alone is a lovely thing. A small, ancient world holding a thin, invisible shield, so near the brightest star in our neighborhood. Earth's magnetosphere is larger and more familiar in spirit, at least to scientists, and to anyone who enjoys beautiful images of auroras curling near the poles. Mercury's version is more compact, more exposed, more intimate with the sun. It does not have the roomy grandeur of Earth's magnetic environment. It lives under pressure. The solar wind pushes against it constantly, squeezing the sunward side inward and stretching the night side into a long magnetic tail. Even this shape feels elegant when you picture it. A little world leaning into the stream of solar particles, with an invisible field drawn back behind it like dark silk in motion. Because Mercury is so close to the sun, conditions there can change quickly. The solar wind is stronger and more intense than what Earth receives, and that gives Mercury's magnetosphere a restless quality. There are bursts, shifts, magnetic reconnection events, and sudden particle activity that make the region around the planet surprisingly dynamic. So although Mercury's surface feels still and ancient, the space surrounding it is full of subtle movement. It is one more example of the planet's personality. Silent at first glance, more complex the longer you stay. One of the fascinating details is that Mercury's magnetic field is not centered perfectly within the planet the way you might casually expect. It is offset to the north by a noticeable amount. This means the magnetic field is slightly stronger in the northern hemisphere than in the south, and that asymmetry affects how charged particles interact with the planet. It is such a strange little detail, and such a very Mercury detail. Even its magnetism has a quiet quirk to it. This offset field changes where solar particles are more likely to reach the surface. On the southern side, where the magnetic shielding is somewhat weaker, particles from the sun can more easily funnel down and strike the ground. When they do, they can knock atoms loose from the surface, a process called sputtering. The word sounds more dramatic than the image needs to be. You can think of it as tiny energetic taps from the solar wind, enough to free atoms from Mercury's outermost material and send them drifting into space. And that brings you to one of the softest and strangest facts about Mercury. Although it has no thick atmosphere like Earth, it does have an exosphere, a very thin cloud of atoms so sparse that the particles rarely collide with one another. This is not air you could breathe or whether you could stand inside. It is more like a ghost of an atmosphere, a faint envelope made of atoms released from the surface by solar wind impacts, micrometeorite strikes, and simple heating by sunlight. The exosphere contains things like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and oxygen. Some of these atoms come from the rocks themselves, liberated and lifted into this nearly empty shell around the planet. There is something unexpectedly beautiful in that image. Mercury, so apparently bare and silent, is slowly giving off a thin shimmer of material into space, like a stone world exhaling almost too gently to notice. Sodium is especially interesting because it can form a kind of extended tail trailing away from Mercury, pushed outward by sunlight and the solar wind. Yes, Mercury has a tail. A planet with a tail sounds faintly illegal, like it has wandered into the wrong category of celestial object. But here we are. It is not a tail like a comet's broad, bright plume, but a more delicate stream of atoms extending far into space. And because sodium glows in particular ways under sunlight, astronomers have been able to observe this strange feature from afar. Mercury, the quiet little planet near the sun, leaves behind a subtle trail of its own material. There is a special charm in how light and particles keep shaping the story here. The sun is not only a source of illumination and heat, it is also a sculptor of the space around Mercury. It pushes on atoms, it drives the solar wind, it compresses the magnetosphere, it helps create the exosphere by heating the surface and participating in the gentle release of material. On Mercury, the sun is not background scenery. It is the main partner in almost every dance. And yet the dance is not violent in the way your imagination might first assume. It is active, yes, but it unfolds in silence and darkness, in charged particles and invisible fields, in atomic traces drifting above rock. If you could somehow see these processes directly, space around Mercury might look full of delicate luminous structure, magnetic lines curving, particle streams flowing, atoms lifting, escaping, settling into a fragile cloud. The actual experience would be more mathematically elegant than visually theatrical, which is probably why it feels so calming to think about. Spacecraft have helped reveal much of this hidden activity. Missions that studied Mercury closely found evidence of magnetic interactions, particle events, and the composition of the exosphere, turning what once seemed like a plain little rocky planet into a place with a surprisingly rich near-space environment. The more carefully humanity looked, the more Mercury answered. That is true of many worlds, but Mercury seems especially good at rewarding patience. There is also a deeper emotional pattern here. Mercury looks exposed, and in many ways it is. It lacks a thick atmosphere, it sits close to the sun. It carries the marks of ancient bombardment, and still it has this faint magnetic field, this small but real way of shaping what reaches it. It does not block everything. It does not create perfect safety, but it influences the encounter. It changes the flow. There is something quietly moving in that. Even a small world can shape the forces around it. As the solar wind brushes past Mercury and the magnetosphere flexes in response, atoms continue to rise from the surface and drift into the exosphere. Some escape to space, some fall back, some are pushed into long extended structures. The boundary between planet and surrounding space becomes less sharp than you might expect. Mercury is not sealed off. It is in exchange with its environment, giving and receiving, shaped from outside and from within. Keep that image nearby. A dense iron world beneath, a faint magnetic shield around it, a whisper-thin exosphere above it, sodium streaming out in a long, subtle tail, charged particles moving through darkness near the blazing sun. Mercury is no longer just a cratered stone in your mind. It is becoming a complete place, with layers you can't quite see and processes so light they feel almost secret. And among those secrets lies one of the most tender paradoxes in the whole solar system. In this fierce neighborhood, so close to the sun, where heat dominates the imagination, there are places near Mercury's poles where sunlight never reaches at all. Deep inside permanently shadowed craters, hidden from the sun's glare for ages, something cold and fragile has endured. Ice, quietly waiting in the brightest part of the solar system. That is one of Mercury's loveliest contradictions. You spend so much time thinking about the fierce sunlight, the slow-burning days, the exposed rock, the black sky, and the giant sun hanging overhead. And then the planet quietly reveals that some of its coldest and most delicate treasures have been there the whole time, hidden in shadow near the poles. In those places, inside certain craters whose floors never receive direct sunlight, water ice can survive for extraordinarily long periods. It is such a gentle fact, and such a strange one, that it almost changes the emotional temperature of the entire planet. You can picture the geometry of it. Mercury's axis is tilted only by a tiny amount, much less than Earth's. Earth leans enough to create strong seasons, shifting sunlight north and south over the year. Mercury barely leans at all. That means at the poles, the sun always stays very low on the horizon. It never climbs high overhead there. And inside deep craters near those polar regions, some floors and inner walls remain in permanent shadow. Light skims the rim. The surrounding terrain may glow. But down in the deepest parts, the sun never enters. Those permanently shadowed regions act like cold traps. Even on a planet so close to the sun, if sunlight never reaches a place and there is no atmosphere to carry heat efficiently into it, temperatures can remain astonishingly low. Cold enough, in fact, for water ice to survive. Mercury becomes a lesson in how local conditions matter just as much as general reputation. A world can be known for heat and still hold pockets of deep cold. A planet can live beside the fire and still keep a little frost hidden in the corners. There is something very peaceful in that. It feels almost like the universe quietly reminding you not to settle for simple labels. Mercury is not only hot, it is not only bright. It contains extremes arranged with great precision, and sometimes the most surprising things endure exactly where they seem least likely. The first hints of this polar ice came from radar observations from Earth. Scientists noticed unusually bright radar reflections from Mercury's polar regions, especially inside certain craters, and those reflections matched what you would expect from water ice beneath a thin covering of darker material. Later spacecraft observations strengthened the case, showing that these shadowed areas really could stay cold enough to preserve ice over long spans of time. What once sounded almost too elegant to be true turned out to be real. There is frozen water on Mercury, tucked away where sunlight cannot touch it. and that image stays with you. Bright Mercury, dark crater, ice at the bottom. The ice is thought to exist in deposits inside these permanently shadowed craters, in some cases perhaps covered by a layer of darker insulating material. That cover matters because it can help protect the ice from slow loss over time. The surface above may be subtle and dusty looking, while below, the cold remains. It is a quiet arrangement, nothing flashy, just geometry, shadow, and patience keeping something fragile intact in a place where most people would never think to look. How did the water get there in the first place? That question opens another soft little mystery. Some of it may have been delivered by comets or water-rich asteroids striking Mercury over long stretches of time. Some could also have come from chemical processes involving hydrogen from the solar wind interacting with oxygen in surface minerals, though impact delivery is often considered an important part of the story. Over ages, molecules that found their way into cold, permanently shadowed regions could become trapped there and remain. It is a slow story. No rush, no dramatic reveal, just water arriving by ancient roots and settling at last into darkness. That is one of the reasons Mercury feels so rewarding when you stay with it. Each new fact gently changes the previous one. The heat becomes more interesting when you learn about shadow. The bright sun becomes more meaningful when you realize there are places it never reaches. The bare cratered surface becomes softer in the imagination when you know that some of those craters shelter ice. And of course, this is not the kind of ice you would experience on Earth with wind on your face and snow under your boots, and that very specific regret that comes from realizing your hands are colder than you expected. Mercury offers none of those familiar comforts. Its polar ice exists in deep stillness, in blackness, under a sky that remains star-filled even in daytime. It is cold without weather, frozen without seasons in the earthly sense, preserved not by clouds or winter, but by the permanent architecture of shadow. The craters themselves become more beautiful when you think of them this way. Earlier, they were records of impact and age. Now some of them are also shelters. Their depth and shape matter not only as signs of history, but as guardians of temperature. A crater rim can decide whether sunlight enters. A slope angle can determine whether ice survives. On Mercury, the surface is not merely scenery. It is destiny. There is a broader cosmic charm here too. Water ice appears in many surprising places across the solar system. Hidden beneath moons, mixed into comets, frozen at the poles of distant worlds, tucked into permanently shadowed pockets. Water is patient. It travels. It survives in odd corners. And on Mercury, its presence is especially poetic because the contrast is so sharp. The nearest planet to the Sun sounds like the last place you would casually store frozen water. And yet there it is, quietly proving that the universe enjoys paradox almost as much as it enjoys gravity. You can imagine hovering above Mercury's North Pole, looking across a landscape where sunlight lies low and long over crater rims, while inside certain depths there is only darkness. No blue glow, no soft reflection, no visible sparkle in the usual sense. Just shadow so stable that it becomes a kind of climate. And within that climate, ice. It gives the planet a hidden tenderness. Mercury is often introduced as if it belongs to the category of extremes. Hottest days, deepest temperature swings, harsh exposure, giant iron core, solar wind, all very stern and respectable. But then you reach the poles and discover these quiet repositories of cold, these secret places of preservation, and the whole planet softens. It feels less like a simple world of punishment and more like a carefully balanced one, where even the fiercest neighborhood contains room for stillness and shelter. That balance matters because it also connects Mercury to the broader story of the solar system. Ice is not just pretty, it is information. It can tell you about delivery from comets and asteroids, about the history of volatiles in the inner solar system, about how materials move and survive even close to the sun. So these shadowed craters are not only beautiful, they are meaningful. They are little vaults of planetary memory. And once human beings realized that Mercury held ice, the planet became even harder to dismiss as a simple rocky leftover. It gained another layer of personality, another contradiction, another reason to be studied with care. A hot world with cold traps, a bright planet with hidden darkness, a place of exposed stone that still preserves something fragile. That human effort to understand Mercury is its own gentle story. For most of history, the planet was only a difficult light in twilight, close to the sun and hard to observe well. Then little by little, with telescopes, radar, and eventually spacecraft, it became more than a point of light. It became a world with cliffs, plains, a giant core, a magnetic field, an exosphere, and polar ice. Mercury did not change during that process. Our relationship to it did. We learned how to see it. And that way of seeing came from messengers sent across space, machines carrying human curiosity into the innermost dark. Soon, it is worth drifting alongside them, because the story of Mercury is also the story of how patiently humanity learned to meet a world that never made itself easy to know. By the time you reach the human part of Mercury's story, the planet already feels familiar in a quiet way. You have seen its strange sunrise, its scarred plains, its giant hidden core, its faint magnetic shield, and its ice tucked into permanent shadow. It has stopped being a bright dot near the sun and become a real place in the mind. And that change, that movement from distant point of light to textured world, did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, patiently, through a series of observations and missions that had to work harder than usual just to get close. Mercury is not an easy destination. That is part of its character. Because it lies so deep in the sun's gravity well, reaching it with a spacecraft is surprisingly difficult. You might think that falling inward toward the sun should be simple, but space travel is rarely impressed by first impressions. A spacecraft launched from Earth already carries a great deal of the same sideways orbital motion Earth has around the sun. To get to Mercury, it is not enough to head inward. You have to shed a lot of that orbital energy. You have to slow down relative to the sun, carefully and cleverly, so that Mercury does not simply flash by below you while you continue onward. Reaching the innermost planet is less like dropping a stone and more like performing a delicate dance with gravity. That is why the missions to Mercury feel so elegant. They had to use planetary flybys, intricate trajectories, and tremendous patience. Even our machines had to approach Mercury on its own terms. For a long time, Mercury remained the least explored of the rocky planets. Venus had its veil of clouds, Mars had its deserts and dreams, the Moon was close enough to touch, but Mercury stayed difficult. It lingered near the sun in the sky, hard to observe clearly from Earth and hard to reach with spacecraft. That only adds to the sweetness of the missions that finally did arrive. They were not casual visits, they were earned. The first spacecraft to visit Mercury was Mariner 10 in the 1970s. It was the pioneer, the first messenger to give humanity close views of the planet. Mariner 10 used a gravity assist from Venus, a wonderfully graceful technique in which a spacecraft borrows a little momentum from a planet to reshape its path. It flew past Mercury 3 times, returning the first detailed images of the surface and making one of the mission's great discoveries. Mercury has a magnetic field. That one fact alone changed the planet's personality overnight. A small, heavily cratered world so close to the sun was not supposed to be so quietly interesting, and yet there it was, already resisting simple categories. Mariner 10 showed vast cratered terrain, enormous basins, long cliffs, and a world that looked ancient and complex. But it did not map the whole planet. Because of the geometry of its flybys and Mercury's own slow rotation, only part of the surface was imaged well. So the first close look at Mercury was revealing but incomplete. There were still unseen regions, still unanswered questions, still the feeling of a half-opened door. That feeling lasted for decades. Mercury remained known but only partly known, and there is something almost charming in that pause. Humanity got a first glance, learned just enough to become more curious, and then had to wait. The planet kept circling the sun, silent as ever, while engineers and scientists slowly prepared for a deeper return. That return came with Messenger, a mission whose name fits the planet almost too perfectly. Mercury was named for a swift messenger god, and then, after long planning, a spacecraft called Messenger set out to meet it. Sometimes reality is unusually cooperative with symbolism. Messenger launched in 2004 and took years to arrive, using flybys of Earth, Venus, and Mercury itself to carefully reshape its orbit. It finally entered orbit around Mercury in 2011, becoming the first spacecraft ever to do so. Once in orbit, Messenger transformed Mercury from a partly known object into a richly studied world. It mapped the entire planet. It examined the composition of the surface. It studied the magnetic field, the exosphere, the geology, the gravity field, and the polar regions. It confirmed the presence of water ice in permanently shadowed craters near the poles. It revealed volcanic plains more clearly. It helped refine our understanding of Mercury's enormous core and long history of contraction. In a very real sense, Messenger gave Mercury back its full face. There is something moving about that. For thousands of years, people saw Mercury only as a brief light in twilight. Then one machine, built by many minds and many hands, entered orbit and patiently traced the shape of an entire world. Messenger also showed how complicated Mercury is despite its simple outward appearance. The planet turned out to be rich in sulfur and other volatile-related chemistry in ways that surprised some expectations. Its magnetic field was offset northward. Its surface held evidence of explosive volcanic processes in the distant past. Hollows, small bright depressions likely formed by the loss of volatile material from the surface, appeared as yet another delicate mystery. Mercury kept unfolding. Every time scientists thought they had the basic picture, another subtle detail arrived and made the planet more interesting. And all of this came from a spacecraft working in a very demanding place, close to the sun, managing intense heat while orbiting a world that itself had never been easy to reach. The engineering is part of the wonder too. Scientific knowledge often sounds neat when summarized later, but each clean fact usually rests on years of calculation, testing, adjustment, and persistence. Mercury asked a lot of the people who wanted to know it better. They answered with patience. Messenger's mission ended in 2015, when the spacecraft, having used most of its fuel, eventually struck Mercury's surface. Even that ending feels fitting in a quiet way. The Messenger became part of the world it had studied, one final contact after years of orbiting above old craters and long shadows. And the story did not stop there. Another mission, Bepi Colombo, launched as a joint European and Japanese effort, is continuing humanity's patient relationship with Mercury. It is designed to study the planet in even greater detail, especially its interior, magnetic environment, surface composition, and interaction with the solar wind. Reaching Mercury, again, requires time and care. The journey involves multiple flybys and a long, gradual approach, because the innermost planet still refuses to be easy, which, honestly, is very on brand. What I like most about these missions is the emotional shape of the story. They were not sent to a planet that loudly demanded attention. Mercury did not advertise itself with giant rings or bright clouds or rumors of life. It was just there, low in the twilight, difficult to observe, close to the sun, almost easy to overlook. And still, people kept going back to it in thought, then in calculation, then in hardware. Curiosity stayed with the small planet. That feels deeply human. You can sense a kind of tenderness in the way science approaches such a world, first with naked eye watching, then with telescopes, then radar, then flybys, then orbit, each stage adding texture, each stage turning mystery into familiarity without ever quite exhausting the wonder. Mercury teaches that knowledge does not remove beauty, it often deepens it. Now when you picture the planet, you do not see a bright point near sunset and stop there. You can imagine the cliffs crossing old craters, the sun hanging huge in a black sky, the faint exosphere of sodium and calcium, the ice hidden in polar darkness, the giant iron core turning quietly below it all. Human beings learned those things because they sent messengers into the inner solar system and listened carefully to what came back. And once you know that, Mercury feels less distant than before. Still remote, of course. Still airless, ancient, and severe in places, but no longer unreachable in the imagination. It has become one of the places the human mind has touched, not by standing there, but by studying, orbiting, mapping, and slowly understanding. That slow understanding matters because it prepares you for the final mood of the journey. After all the facts, all the strange timings, all the scars and shadows and fields and hidden ice, Mercury gathers into something more than a list of discoveries. It becomes a kind of meditation on closeness and endurance, on a small world living near the sun with an elegance that is easy to miss if you look too quickly. And if you stay with it just a little longer, Mercury begins to feel less like the hottest neighborhood and more like one of the calmest portraits in the solar system. By now, Mercury has become something very different from the planet people usually imagine when they first hear its name. It no longer feels like a harsh little rock placed too close to the sun as some kind of cosmic experiment in inconvenience. It feels older than that description, gentler than that description, and far more complete. Once you have stayed with it long enough, once you have watched its strange sunrise hesitate in the black sky, traced the old scars across its surface, followed the cliffs left by its slow contraction, drifted down in thought toward its giant iron core, and hovered above those craters where ice survives in permanent darkness, the planet gathers itself into a quieter shape. It becomes a place of balance. Severe in some ways, yes, but also elegant, measured, and deeply still. There is comfort in that stillness. Mercury lives in an intense part of the solar system, but intensity is not the same thing as noise. That may be one of the most relaxing truths it offers. The sun is huge in its sky. Light arrives with tremendous force. Temperatures swing from fierce brightness to deep cold. The solar wind moves across the planet's small magnetic field. Atoms are lifted into a whisper-thin exosphere. And yet the feeling of Mercury is not chaos, it is clarity. You can almost sense why. So many of the layers that complicate life on Earth are absent there. No weather crossing the sky, no oceans shifting with storms and tides, no forests breathing, no cities glowing, no atmosphere to blur the view or carry sound. Mercury is stripped down to fundamentals: rock, metal, light, shadow, gravity, time. It is a planet of essentials, and when a world is reduced to essentials, it can become strangely restful to contemplate. That does not mean Mercury is simple. It is one of the least simple places we have visited in the inner solar system once you begin paying attention. Its orbit is fast but not circular. Its day is longer than its year in the solar sense. Its sun can appear to slow, pause, and reverse in the sky. Its surface keeps the memory of ancient impacts with unusual honesty. Its crust bears the long wrinkles of a planet that cooled and shrank. Its interior is dominated by a vast metallic core. Its magnetic field survives, offset and faint. Its exosphere drifts in atom-thin quiet. Its poles hold ice in darkness. Mercury is full of details, but they belong together so gracefully that the planet still feels clean in the mind. That is what makes it soothing. Everything there seems to follow from everything else. The slow sunrise belongs to the unusual dance of orbit and rotation. The deep shadows belong to the lack of atmosphere and the low polar sun. The preserved craters belong to long stillness. The scarps belong to cooling. The magnetic field belongs to the liquid metal inside. The exosphere belongs to the solar wind and the exposed surface. The ice belongs to geometry, darkness, and time. Mercury is not a pile of disconnected oddities. It is a world with a very quiet internal logic. And once you feel that logic, the planet starts to seem almost intimate. Not familiar in the earthly sense, of course. No one would mistake Mercury for a place of rivers, clouds, evening air, or any of the things that make Earth emotionally easy to love. Mercury asks for a different kind of affection. It asks for patience. It asks you to appreciate surfaces that do not change much, shadows that last a very long time, and facts that reveal themselves gradually. It is a planet for slow attention. There is something deeply reassuring about that in a restless age. Mercury does not rush, even when it is moving quickly. That sounds contradictory, but you can feel the truth of it. It races around the sun faster than any other planet, yet nothing about it feels frantic. The movement is exact. The rhythm is settled. The world keeps its path without drama. Even the long solar day, with its stretched-out cycle of light and dark, feels like a refusal to hurry. Mercury lives close to the sun and still keeps a kind of composure. You might even say that Mercury turns exposure into serenity. It has almost no atmosphere to protect it, and still it endures. It bears the marks of impacts, and still it remains whole. It cooled and shrank, and the evidence stayed on the surface like lines on an old face. It interacts constantly with sunlight and charged particles, yet it does not appear busy. It simply exists in that environment with remarkable steadiness. That steadiness is one reason the planet becomes more beautiful the longer you think about it. At first glance, many people might choose other worlds to love first. Saturn has rings, Jupiter has storms. Mars has that lonely red romance people keep trying to turn into personality. Venus glows. Neptune carries its deep blue distance. Mercury is easier to skip. It is smaller, grayer, less theatrical. But then, with a little time, it becomes unforgettable in its own way. It is the planet that teaches you how much quiet detail can be hidden inside a modest appearance. And perhaps that is part of why it feels so peaceful at the end of this journey. Mercury does not need to impress you all at once. It lets wonder arrive slowly. First the brief twilight appearance in Earth's sky, then the quick year, then the long day, then the sun that seems to hesitate, then the old cratered plains, then the cliffs of contraction, then the iron core, then the magnetic murmur, then the impossible-seeming ice. Fact by fact, the little world grows larger in the imagination, even as it remains physically small. You can hold it now as a complete picture, a dense planet close to the sun, turning slowly beneath a black sky, a place where sunlight writes long, sharp shadows across crater rims and basin floors, a place where ancient scars remain visible because almost nothing arrives to erase them, a place where deep interior metal still shapes an invisible field around the planet, a place where darkness at the poles protects frozen water for ages, a place where time seems stretched into clean, quiet forms. And there is something lovely in the idea that one of the most calming planets to imagine is also the closest one to the sun. It feels like a soft correction to the assumptions you might carry into the story. Closeness to brightness does not automatically mean agitation. Exposure does not always mean disorder. A world can live under fierce light and still become a portrait of silence. That is Mercury's final gift, really. It invites you to see calm in a place where you did not expect it. It asks you to notice elegance in a world often reduced to a single harsh adjective. It reminds you that reality is usually more textured than reputation. So when you picture Mercury now, perhaps you will not picture only heat. Perhaps you will picture evening light from Earth, when the planet appears for a short while above the horizon like a small, patient secret. Perhaps you will picture the slow movement of shadows over an ancient crater. Perhaps you will picture a dark polar floor where ice waits in silence. Perhaps you will picture that giant buried core, dense and hidden, quietly shaping everything above it. Perhaps you will picture a world that lives close to the sun, and yet somehow feels full of composure. And as this long, quiet journey reaches its rest, you can let Mercury keep circling in your mind exactly as it has always circled the sun, swift and precise, silent and enduring, a small, bright world carrying deep time in stone. The image softens now. The details do not need to work so hard anymore. You can let them settle into something gentler. Mercury can simply remain there, close to the sun, drifting through your imagination as a calm little sphere of iron and rock, with its long shadows and hidden ice and black sky full of stillness. You do not need to remember every number. You do not need to hold every scientific term in place. It is enough to keep the feeling of the planet. Small, ancient, quietly strange, bright at the edges, dark in the hollows, and patient all the way through. You can let the surface grow more distant now, the scarps smoothing into lines, the craters softening into texture, the great basin becoming only a pale curve under sunlight. The enormous sun above Mercury can dim in your mind until it is only warmth at the edge of the scene. The black sky can widen and widen until the whole planet seems suspended inside an endless peaceful dark. And somewhere near the poles, those hidden shadows can stay just as they are, protecting their old ice without fuss, without sound, without asking to be noticed. The exosphere can remain a faint breath of atoms. The magnetic field can keep its silent shape in the solar wind. The iron core can rest deep below, carrying its slow heat, its old memory, its quiet influence. Mercury does not need applause. It never did. It is content to be a world of long days, brief appearances, and deep endurance. A world that keeps its secrets in plain sight for anyone willing to look slowly. So you can drift away from it now with that feeling beside you. A feeling of stillness under bright light. A feeling of old stone holding time. A feeling that even in the fiercest places, there can be calm. And somewhere out there, beyond this room, beyond this night, beyond the small earthly sounds around you, Mercury continues its neat little orbit around the sun, exactly on time, exactly itself, moving quickly and somehow never hurrying.